In the 7th century, Africa attracted outsiders because of its wealth, beauty, and trade. In this episode, we look at how an African culture known as the Swahili civilization arose along the continent's Indian Ocean coast with the arrival of the Arabs. And we also see how the Arabs began an international trade in enslaved Africans, centuries before the transatlantic slave trade. The local population on the east coast of Africa along the Indian Ocean originally consisted of groups closely related to the San of southern Africa and the Bantus of western and central areas. This coastline stretches for more than 3,000 kilometers, so historically it was a gateway. The east coast of Africa is accessible from the interior of the continent and from the exterior across the Indian Ocean. This helped foster links with both India and the Arab world. The Indians were interested in African ivory, but it was the Arabs who dominated trade on the East African coast. Along with Arabs and Indians, archaeological evidence also shows to a lesser extent that Persians settled along Africa's Indian Ocean coast, and there was certainly trade with distant China. The Arabs also went to Africa via the Red Sea and across the Mediterranean into North Africa and west through the Sahara Desert. But in this program, we focus on their arrival in the coastal settlements of the Indian Ocean, in modern-day Mozambique, Kenya, and Tanzania. The Arabs who came here were mostly from Oman in the Gulf and the Arabian Peninsula. Between the 9th and 14th centuries, 8 major Swahili trade ports became established: Mogadishu, Lamu, Malindi, Mombasa, Zanzibar, Kilwa, the island of Mozambique, and Sofala. They were like stepping stones along the Indian Ocean. Arabs settled in these coastal areas, which became vibrant and rich. And at different times throughout the centuries, one of these trading centers would dominate over the others. Maurizio Regulo teaches history on the island of Mozambique and says Africans mixed immediately with the Arabs.
Alguns iam criando aquelas questões chamadas por concubinagem, não é? Árabe vinha para aqui com o seu negócio, chegava aqui, conhecia uma mulher e quando vinha na próxima vez, ele sabia onde hospedar-se.
I set off to find out more about this culture. First to Lamu Island in Kenya, close to the border with Somalia. I'm lucky enough to sit in the cockpit with the pilots on the journey from Nairobi, a friendly pair. Sadly, they could not fix the weather. Too much cloud and rain meant Lamu was not visible from the air, despite the best efforts of the somewhat manic windscreen wipers on the plane. Well done, Nick. For one of them, it was just too much. The fusion of African with Arab, some Indian and later European influences is what we describe as the Swahili culture. Swahili civilization is very evident in Lamu, which is Kenya's oldest continually inhabited town and is believed to have been established in the mid-14th century. Once the rain stopped, I meet Muhammad Mwenje, an architect specializing in historic buildings. How would you define Swahili culture?
Let's say from the medieval, a lot of European influence can be seen in Swahili culture. So I'd say Swahili has really borrowed from across the globe with different nations that it traded with. So the influence just goes beyond the Indian and Arabian Peninsula. You have the European influence, even in the language. A lot of Swahili words actually borrowed from the Portuguese. A lot of Swahili technology is borrowed from the Chinese during the later periods. So it's actually a global influence that enriches the Swahili culture. At the center of the Swahili culture is, of course, the African heritage, and which has been enriched by influences from all over the world during certain phases. We can be able to see this from the period pre-Stone Town Swahili settlements, where the structure were basically African, mud and wattle structure, using palm leaf throngs for the roofing. And many, many other aspects. The Swahili pottery of that time, it's very, very much African. The Swahili language itself, a very big percentage of it, is actually related to the Bantu tribes of Africa. So it's pretty much an African culture with a lot of external influences.
I ask Mohammed to expand a bit more on the old part of Lamu.
The old town of Lamu, the historic part, is about 16 hectares. It sits along a coastline. Most of the buildings are actually from the 17th century. And Lamu actually starts off as two settlements, two independent settlements, one in the north, one in the south, which are dated around the 13th century. And eventually, sometime probably during the 14th century, they start off the town as it sits today.
It's one of several Swahili coastal settlements along the east coast of Africa. How would you describe their uniformity? Is there something which is the same about all of them, or are they very different?
What is common, or you might find in many of the Swahili settlements, is the urban structure. You have towns like Lamu with a linear structure. They are aligned along the coastline. And then you have some with a nuclear structure, where you have a mosque, probably a Friday mosque in the middle, and the settlement is built around it. That's a very common feature of the Swahili settlements. You can actually tell from the building technology of that time that they were probably sharing ideas. You find the deco in the North Swahili settlements very similar to what you find in Kilwa. The spacing of the different rooms in the house, the orientation, of course, based on the Muslim North.
What about the doors? That seems to be something that's, you know, the beautifully carved wooden doors is something you see in all these settlements.
The knowledge or the technology transfer was quite frequent among the settlements, each town adapting different decorative elements from the other one. So, for example, this is a Omani-style door. This is done in Lamu, and it's been adapted specifically for Lamu. But you can see the inspiration, the floral inspiration from the Omani style.
Also in Kenya, just over 100 kilometres north of Mombasa, is Malindi. Settled since the 12th century, it gained a reputation as a major port city. The prosperity of this part of East Africa can also be seen in a small town near Malindi called Gedi. This is a UNESCO World Heritage Site and dates probably to the 1200s. Gedi was built entirely from rocks and stones. It was encircled by two walls. The inner one was where the wealthy lived. The outer wall included farmland with a number of mud and wattle houses for the middle class. This is the palace. Here's the tomb. This area was the men's court, and this the women's. Beyond the walls is where the peasant farmers lived. The historic town of Gedi was mysteriously abandoned in the 18th century. One of the most magnificent of the Swahili historic sites is another UNESCO World Heritage Site, Kilwa in modern-day Tanzania. Today it may be in ruins and uninhabited, but its maze of fine buildings, some dating back to the 10th century, show this was once a thriving port city. Goods like gold and ivory from the interior of Africa were transported through its winding, narrow alleys. From the 14th century, Kilwa took control of the gold trade in the region and became very powerful and wealthy. Trade was the lifeblood of the Swahili settlements. Along with goods to exchange, people shared ideas and customs. Amira Said Muslim is a guest lecturer on Swahili civilization at several universities across Kenya, and also in Europe and the United States. She invites me for tea at a local restaurant in Mombasa in Kenya. She speaks in Swahili, which borrows a large number of words from Arabic.
Waarabu walipokuja, walikuja katika gerigeri ya pwani na waliona watu katika pwani, Waswahili wenyewe wakauliza, nyinyi ni kina nani? Wao wakasema, sisi ni watu wa Swahili. Watu wa Swahili, wale Waarabu wakachukua kuwa they are Swahili. Na vile vile Waarabu wakawa wametaka wanawake kuwaoa, wakawaoa wanawake wa Kiswahili. Wanawake wa Kiswahili wakazaa nao, na kila kitu ambacho wanafanya Kiswahili wenyewe wanajua. Watu wengi wa upande wa bara walikuja kwa Swahili, na zamani ulikuwa ukiwa wewe ni Mswahili na unataka kuwa Mswahili, ni lazima uache mila, desturi yako, uingie katika Uswahili. Na pale Waswahili walikuwa wakibai, wakibai kwa huyu sasa amekuwa Mswahili, na kila kitu ambacho tunafanya sisi ni lazima yeye afahamishwe. Na marriage ambao ni harusi, ni lazima afanye harusi za Kiswahili na kualika community wote kwa sisi tuko pamoja. It's too much. This is too much.
No, it's good.
I didn't know that it would be too much. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Oh, where are you going with my tea?
She'll bring you more tea. As well as cultural and linguistic influences, there was, of course, religion, Islam. Muhammad Abdul Qadir and his family are from Lamu and live in the Old Town. At the time of filming, it's Ramadan and they invite me to break the fast with them. Luckily for me, Muhammad can speak good Arabic.
أنت أين تعلمت العربية؟
لا أنا ما عشت السودان
في شمال السودان.
يعني اللغة في المنزل.
وأنت كم عندك من الأولاد؟
4 ما شاء الله، ولدان وبنتان.
جزاك الله خير.
It's not uncommon to find Swahili people who can speak Arabic, but the spread of Islam was much more extensive than that of the Arabic language. The beautiful Swahili settlement of the island of Mozambique is about 1,500 kilometers northeast of the present-day capital, Maputo. To reach it, you have to fly from there to the town of Nampula and then drive some distance to arrive on the island. The Arabs first came to the island of Mozambique around the 10th century. In fact, some local sources suggest Mozambique is derived from the name of an Arab trader called Musa Bek. Almost everybody on the island of Mozambique is Muslim, though the majority of Mozambicans today are Christian or follow traditional beliefs. I want to get a sense of how the people on the island interpret their culture and religious practices, and I'm told there's one woman who's happy to meet me. Fatima Momade is a widow. Every day she makes the 10-minute walk from her home to the hotel where she works as a housekeeper. It's a historic mansion that's now a guest house. Fatima's passion is dancing. Evening falls and another day's work is over. Fatima sets off for her weekly class with the Asante dance group, a chance to indulge in her favourite hobby along with fellow enthusiasts. She pauses to take a phone call and is late. Pippi Poyata, the founder of the dance group who still leads the women at 90, is not impressed with Fatima's timekeeping. And it's getting late in the evening for Pippi's great-granddaughter, who's keen to get going. The ladies put their squabble behind them and Fatima joins the group without her costume and decorative face powder. Later, Fatima, who's of course Muslim, invites me to her home and tells me that observance of the religion is as important today as it has been throughout the centuries. A neighbour, Ali, who speaks Arabic, is my interpreter. Fatima, I've noticed walking around the island of Mozambique that most of the women are wearing the hijab in some shape or form, or that their head is covered. Is that right? I mean, is that the correct perception?
Porque eles estão a desenvolver, já são muçulmanos, estão a rezar, diminuir coisas que faziam mal, para ana swali, ana tukaramatani, ana wirepata, são mulheres casadas, chuo, não pode andar nu, tem que tapar mal, tem que tapar tudo, para os homens não apreciar. Pode apreciar seu marido e não qualquer homem na rua. Por isso eles usam assim.
I'd had a tip-off that Fatima is very skilled in one traditional beauty treatment. She shows me how she makes a paste of local powder ground from a plant and mixed with water. Well, it feels quite cool. I've no idea what I look like, but it's certainly very soothing. Thank you. I'll put some on you now. Okay, Fatima. Okay. I'll put this here, and we can just chill and relax. As my face mask dries, I continue chatting to Fatima about her life, family, and work. Neighbouring Mozambique is Tanzania, and this is where I head to see one of the best known of the Swahili coastal settlements, the island of Zanzibar, part of the nation of Tanzania. It's a short ferry ride from Dar es Salaam on the mainland, and the sight of the island as you approach is truly impressive. Zanzibar's historic stone town has a stunning architecture and building design, and its gardens are immaculately kept. However, the impact of Arab culture on local African traditions had a very undesirable and ultimately tragic consequence, according to the Tanzanian historian Professor Felix Chami, who meets me in Zanzibar. He's one of the original contributors to UNESCO's General History of Africa, from which the series draws its facts.
The African people who are originating from the early Iron Age and before, they are now seeing themselves as Arabs. They are arguing that they are Arabs because of that control and influence of Arabs and Islam. They are Muslims, and for their mind to be a Muslim, it means you are an Arab. So that's a major problem in the history of the coast of East Africa, because now you are dealing with the people who identify themselves as foreigners.
This identity and culture helped to greatly facilitate the Indian Ocean slave trade, as we see after the break. The Indian Ocean slave trade was made possible largely because some Swahili chiefs identified with Arab culture, and this contributed to the proliferation in the trade of enslaved Africans. Although the Arabs also acquired slaves from India and Southeast Asia across the Indian Ocean, it was mostly Africans who were the victims. Exact figures are hard to ascertain, but it's believed in total around 14 million Africans were shipped out by the Arabs and their partners between the 7th and 19th centuries. This included all routes across the Indian Ocean, the Red Sea, the Mediterranean, and across the Sahara to North Africa. Most slaves went to Arabia, many ended up in Persia and the Indian subcontinent.
Sim, porque eu, na minha opinião, não era o árabe comprador que ia buscar o escravo lá na população. Quem ia buscar é o chefe local. E geralmente procurava-se aquele indivíduo que não gostavam dele, ou porque por algum motivo era chamado, por exemplo, um indisciplinado ou indesejado. Então, eram esses que eram vendidos. Então, é evidente que houve colaboração, sim, de facto, dos nativos, sobretudo os chefes desses grupos étnicos ou grupos clânicos que eu tentei referir aqui. Eram esses que vendiam essas pessoas.
UNESCO's General History of Africa states that some Swahili chiefs were undoubtedly involved in acquiring slaves. Sometimes slaves were sold to Europeans. Africans were used as porters to carry goods like ivory, gold, copper and ebony for many, many kilometers from the interior of the continent to the East African coast. But once they arrived on the coast, they would not be released. Instead, they would be taken across the Indian Ocean to work as slaves. Father William Kitama is the priest at St. Paul's Church in Rabai outside Mombasa in Kenya. He explains the way payments were made by Arabs and their Swahili agents and how at times they resorted to deceitful means to obtain slaves.
When the Arabs rulers down the coast, they appointed the Swahili as the agents, and also they made some of the Swahili people as the chiefs. So it was easy for them, for the slave trade to penetrate in the interior to get the slaves. Because here is a chief who is an Arab. He has appointed a Swahili man who deal with the people as his agent, and they could just bring some things as a barter trade, give it to the agent, and the agent could just come down to the local people, and they could exchange some other goods. But that was their plan, because after that barter trade, then the same people were used by the chiefs and the agents to call people that there is some goodies that has come with the Arab rulers. But that's the time when they were captured. They were captured, and not all captured, but the chief was given a token, was paid, and the agent was also paid. And sometimes they could just, to the local elder person, give him something, especially a gun, and then he allows his people taken as slave trades.
Unlike the transatlantic slave trade, in which men were double the number of women, in the Indian Ocean slave trade, African female captives are believed to have outnumbered males. The Arabs used enslaved Africans as farm labourers, menial servants, but also craftsmen and soldiers, and the women could become concubines. Now, one interesting point is that if an African woman bore a child from an Arab, that child would be free. In contrast, in the transatlantic slave trade, a child born between a white man and his female captive would be born a slave. And indeed, there are examples of white slave owners selling their own mixed-race offspring. And there is another striking feature of the Arab slave trade.
Só que existe aqui pormenor especial que eu gostaria de dizer isso. Os árabes o que faziam? Eles castravam o escravo. Para quê? Para não incomodar a senhora. Quer dizer, eles diziam para não infectar a raça. Homem africano não podia casar com uma mulher árabe.
A number of male slaves were castrated by their Arab masters, and as eunuchs, they were tasked with keeping watch over concubines. Castration was a brutal operation with a survival rate of only 10%. Enslaved Africans were transported from various points along the coast, including from the island of Mozambique. This spot here on the island of Mozambique on the Indian Ocean marks the point of departure for hundreds and thousands of African men, women and children from the region who were transported across these waters to various parts of the world. This is the garden in memory of those slaves, adjacent to the pit where they were kept, awaiting their fate. The Indian Ocean slave trade was boosted by the fact that from about the 1600s, Arabs from Oman were increasingly asserting themselves over local chiefs in Zanzibar. And so this became the main base for the Indian Ocean slave trade.
Actually, the major control of the Swahili coast by Arabs beginning from 17th century, from about 1600 all the way to about 1800. It's really when we see the Omanis are trying to control the coast of East Africa, and we can see even they are bringing traders here, they are even bringing Indians here, and they are starting to participate in the famous slave trade.
This is the site of the infamous slave market of Zanzibar. At the height of the Arab slave trade in the 19th century, thousands of Africans were sold from here into a life of servitude on the plantations in Zanzibar or were sent back to Oman. As slaves were transported down the coast, they were held at various points en route to Zanzibar. About 175 kilometers north of Zanzibar is the fishing village of Shimoni in modern-day Kenya. The caves of Shimoni became holding pens for enslaved Africans, who could be kept here for up to 3 weeks before being shipped to Zanzibar. The Shimoni caves may have originally been used by people from the interior of the continent to hide when they were running away from slave traders. You can still see the chains on the walls of the cavern where the slaves would have been shackled as they awaited dhows to ship them to the main slave market in Zanzibar, seen here in a sketch by a British illustrator in 1860.
Geralmente as condições não eram das melhores. Primeiro porque tratava-se de um indivíduo que podia fugir a qualquer hora e momento. Eles eram fortes, homens fortes. Então, eram capturados, eram acorrentados, não é? Às vezes nos braços ou no pescoço, toda a família em fila, e depois à espera do patrão comprador. E quando ele chegasse, depois de comprar, eles eram postos dentro do navio. Agora, havia um processo de seleção. Aquele que não servia é aquele que servia. Por exemplo, quem adoecia pelo caminho podia ser lançado ao mar.
By the late 17th century, the Omani Arabs had become the dominant force on Africa's east coast along the Indian Ocean. They now governed most of the region through Swahili rulers. But the Omani Arabs did not enjoy uncontested power along the east coast of Africa. As well as local resistance, there was a rival power that had arrived sometime earlier in the region. The prosperity of the port cities of Africa's east coast had made them the object of European attention. The Portuguese were the first Europeans to arrive in Africa at the end of the 15th century, like the explorer Vasco da Gama. The island of Mozambique was one of the first places he went to. Today, there's a statue to Vasco da Gama on the island and a model of the kind of boat he would have used to come ashore. This is a replica of the boat which Vasco da Gama used when he disembarked on the island of Mozambique in 1498. Thereafter, the Portuguese established themselves on the island because they wanted to control the gold trade, and so they set up supply points on the ocean to the east. And over the next 200 years, the Portuguese built trading enclaves and forts in order to facilitate their trade. Once the Portuguese realized just how many profits the Swahili traders were making, they wanted to control the trade along Africa's east coast on the Indian Ocean. And that set into motion a rivalry, a conflict between the Portuguese and the Arabs for domination of this part of the continent. The Portuguese launched attacks on these coastal towns from the early 16th century. Zanzibar put up fierce resistance. Lamu and Malindi capitulated and agreed to pay taxes and tribute to the Portuguese. On the island of Mozambique and at Sofala, the Portuguese had managed to maintain a good foothold from an early stage. In 1528, the Portuguese gained a big advantage in trade along the Indian Ocean. They succeeded for a time in seizing Mombasa, one of the richest of the Swahili coastal settlements. But their control was almost immediately contested by local African communities, Omani Arabs and Ottoman Turks. In the late 15th, early 16th centuries, the Portuguese voyager Duarte Barbosa wrote of Mombasa,
"Mombasa is a place of great traffic and has a good harbour in which there are always moored small crafts of many kinds and also great ships, both of which are bound from Sofala and others which come from Cambay and Malindi and others which sail to the island of Zanzibar."
In the late 1500s, the Portuguese initiated construction of Fort Jesus, which served as the centre of their operations in East Africa for a century. Fort Jesus is one of the oldest European buildings in Africa. Its construction began about 1593 and still standing because it's pretty solid. At their widest, the walls are about 2.5 meters thick and it stands about 15 meters tall. And it overlooks the old harbour of Mombasa as it always has done. And after Fort Jesus, the Portuguese built more forts on Africa's east coast as they made steady gains along the coastline. On a very windy day, I meet Fatima Tiag, the curator at Fort Jesus.
It was built by an Italian architect, and it has been built using the local material, which is coral with mud mortar and lime plaster. The architecture is unique, it's strong, and it has stood the test of time. It has been in existence for over 400 years. According to historians, the Portuguese recruited the local people, and they were supposed to have been paid in food rations. But we would assume that the local people may not have been too happy about that. Comfortably could say there was possibly an element of more convincing kind of labor.
Fort Jesus was captured by the Omani Arabs in the first half of the 18th century, and Mombasa became part of the Sultanate of Oman. For the next 100 years, the Arabs were dominant here. In 1804, a new Omani Sultan, Sayyid Said, came to power. In 1840, he moved his capital to Zanzibar and expanded his reach across Africa's east coast. He established the clove plantations for which Zanzibar is still famous. Most markets on the island are full of spices like cloves. Sultan Said built a palace for himself known as the House of Wonders. It was the first building in Africa to have an electric lift. And if you wander around it, you still get an idea of the opulent style in which the Sultan and his family lived. Under Sultan Said, the slave trade out of East Africa greatly increased. Many thousands of captives died on the long walk from the interior to the coast. One of the best known of the Swahili slave traders who served the Sultan was Tipu Tip. He was born in Zanzibar but established himself in Central Africa in what became the Democratic Republic of the Congo. His activities in the Congo are notorious and well recorded, as Professor Nziem from Kinshasa University in the Congo sets out.
Bon, il ne faut vraiment pas qu'il y ait de la confusion là-dessus. Le phénomène dit typotype, n'est-ce pas, il s'appelait Ahmed Ben Mohamed El Mojebi. Typotype, c'était un surnom. C'était son surnom. Bon, là, c'est la situation de Zanzibar. Zanzibar, au début du 19e siècle, le sultan d'Oman, qui s'est installé là-bas, fait des plantations de girofléliers. Et il a besoin de la main-d'œuvre. Et puis donc, il faut de la main-d'œuvre. On va commencer à chercher de la main-d'œuvre de proche en proche à l'intérieur du pays. Et puis, on va découvrir que l'ivoire se vend bien en Inde et que Zanzibar devient même un grand marché d'ivoire. Alors, à ce moment-là, et à ce moment-là seulement, maintenant, il va y avoir ce phénomène. C'est-à-dire que les commerçants se trouvant à Zanzibar vont avoir eux aussi leurs intermédiaires métis africains. Et c'est le cas des Swahili, des Arabo-Swahili. Et Typotype est le plus grand parce qu'il parviendra à aller au-delà du Tanganyika, que dis-je, au-delà de l'Omami, de la rivière Lomami, pour chercher des esclaves. Et spécialement des porteurs de l'ivoire pour les amener là.
The Indian Ocean slave trade is a tragic part of Africa's history. The memory of it is alive and embedded in African culture and consciousness. The head of UNESCO in Mozambique at the time of filming says there are mixed feelings about the arrival of the Arabs.
The ambivalence is definitely the issue of bringing in religions as Islam as a peaceful religion, but at the same time the issue of selling human being definitely for individual, I would say, benefit or profit. So this is really a major ambivalence that is still there. And today is more perceived, and although it's not highlighted as such, but this is an area where we need to dig in terms of research to better understand the role of those Arabs.
On the beach on the island of Mozambique, Fatima and her friends at the Asante dance group demonstrate this collective memory through some of their dances. That ambivalence which Dr. Musa mentions is evident. Whilst happy to be Muslim, there is clearly resentment at the enslavement of their ancestors by Arabs and their partners. This dance depicts how an Arab slave trader might have wanted to punish people by whipping them with ropes. Here, one of the dancers is wearing an Arab hat representing a slave master. And in this dance, one of the women faints because her soul has been taken by an Arab who wants to assume her place in the dance. That is a metaphor for displacement. The Indian Ocean slave trade began to recede from the 1800s with the emergence of Imperial Britain as a power on the east coast of Africa. By the late 19th century, the region was mostly under British control, though the Portuguese managed to retain their hold on what became Mozambique. The era of the Europeans was by now firmly established. The arrival of the Arabs on Africa's east coast represents a significant chapter in the continent's history. It marked the first time that Africans were captured and sold in an extensive slave trade. But that is not all. It also redrew the identity of the east coast of Africa, with Arab and Muslim heritage becoming inextricably linked with that of indigenous Africans, creating a rich culture.
When it comes to considering the Swahili civilization in East Africa along the coast of the Indian Ocean, the General History of Africa says it would be wrong to see this as a result of outside influences, because Africans made an immense contribution to these cultures. Otherwise, you're buying into the notion that there are those who make history and those who remain outside of it, and that's just not the case.
In the next episode, we go south and look at some of the early southern kingdoms in Africa, including that of Great Zimbabwe.